focus, and please welcome the group from Nelson County. I'm Tanner.
And I'm Quinn, and we did our experiment on the effects of copper sulfate on Arabidopsis thaliana.
Copper 2 sulfate is a compound composed of the elements copper, sulfur, and oxygen. However, the concentration of copper is the determining factor in the toxicity of the substance. Copper, and specifically in plants, excess copper binds with proteins in the cells, which inhibits the photosynthesis and causes the cells to leak and then die. Commonly, copper sulfate is found in herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, industrial waste, and non-point runoff pollution. Those are some of the reasons why we chose copper sulfate as our variable, because we see it commonly around plants and such in agricultural settings. In our experiment, we applied 25 milliliters of 8 millimolar copper sulfate to our experimental plants on 5 of the days, starting on day 15 of our experiment and concluding on day 29.
So our hypothesis was to see how copper sulfate affects the both wild type and mutant Arabidopsis thaliana. Since the mutant Arabidopsis lack the AADL gene and its flavonoids, which are known antioxidants, they would be more susceptible to the copper 2 sulfate's oxidizing abilities. Also, since the wild type Arabidopsis did contain the AADL gene and its antioxidizing flavonoids, this would cause it to be more counteracting to the abilities of copper sulfate and its oxidizing effects. So throughout our experiment, we took a variety of measurements, which include bolt height and rosette diameter, and later on in the experiment, we took a variety of measurements, which include the side bolts, the siliques, and the flowerings when the bolts bloom. We bottom watered twice a week on the same days that we measured for approximately 3 minutes, and this is also when we added the 25 milliliters of copper sulfate.
As with any experiment, there is always a possibility for human error. For example, in our experiment, Group 1 and Group 2 on separate occasions both added the copper sulfate after bottom watering, which is not part of the procedure. There's also should be a little bit of wiggle room on the measurements, because there may have been some inaccuracies due to different people in the groups measuring them on separate times. Also, towards the end of our experiment, it became apparent to us that all of our plants were experiencing drought, which was an unexpected variable. So we took that all into account when we were examining the results of our experiment. However, throughout our entire experiment, we worked diligently to reduce the amount of error in our procedure and our results by placing all the plants under the same conditions, light, water, and we also had multiple groups in our class that we added the data together so it would reduce the impact of anomalies in the overall data.
So as you can see, this is graph 1 for our presentation. And it shows the comparison between rosette diameter of the wild types and the mutants. When looking at this graph, we can see a lot of a lot of characteristics of the plants. And the first thing I'd like to point out is when you look at line 1 and 2, you can see that they have pretty similar growth patterns. Whereas when you look at line 3, which did receive copper sulfate, it's pretty detrimental to the plant's health. And also, when looking at the comparison of the first two lines, you can see that the wild type control did better solely just because it had a gelatin in it, which leads us to think that flavonoids do more than just antioxidants. So, such as pigments, they don't produce pigments, which is the plant. And when we look at our last line, we can see that that's the mutant experimental, so it did not have ADL and received copper sulfate, and did the worst, which supports our hypothesis that flavonoids are beneficial to the plant, growth. We can also see that around day 32, as Grace mentioned previously, we didn't anticipate drought, but like you can see how they all at the same point start to go downward, which shows drought.
So this is our graph due on the bolt height of the Arabidopsis plants. As you can see, they all experienced a pretty similar bolt height. The individual variables of the AADL and the individual variable of copper 2 sulfate didn't seem to have as much of an effect on the bolt height as we thought. However, in conjunction with copper 2 sulfate and the AADL gene turned off, the mutant experimental was greatly decreased in its growth. Also, in the plant did not seem to be affected by the drought that all the rosette diameters were exposed to. The bolt heights did not have that drop off. You can see in our picture that overall for our plant's growth and development in the mutant plant that was exposed to copper 2 sulfate, it is greatly reduced, whereas in the ones that only have the wild type all seem to have, or that only have copper sulfate, seem to have pretty similar bolt heights overall. However, as in our previous checks in the rosette diameter, wild type control did grow best, with mutant following it, and then the wild type experimental coming right beneath it. So we also did measurements on the leak size, number of bolts, and side bolts. However, we found in this leak size that it wasn't actually affected by the copper sulfate, but rather affected by the AADL gene itself. So we decided that that might be another function of the AADL gene. However, with the number of bolts overall, the experimental plants had multiple bolts coming out of the same plant, which led us to believe that since the plant was feckled, it made a desperate reproductive capabilities of each of the plants overall. However, it had decreased number of side bolts, which we believe is due to the lack of nutrients, since all the nutrients were going into building more bolts and more sleeks in the central area. As you can see, for our wild type plants, they had many more side bolts, but only one main bolt, whereas in our AADL experimental plants had two or three bolts coming out of the same plant, but very few side bolts.
This is some more of our observed data that we gathered. For example, in our first picture, we can see the stunted rosettes of the plant that received the sulfate. And that's the one on the right. You can see also the discoloration from copper sulfate and how it looks slightly more yellow. And then our second picture is a comparison between our wild type experimental and our mutant. And you can see that obviously on the left, the plant, on the right, the plant is worse because it doesn't have the AADL and it receives copper sulfate. Whereas on the left, the plant is more lush and it doesn't have that as much discoloration. The bolts are higher, the rosettes look healthier. And then our third picture, it really shows discoloration of the copper sulfate and the yellow and the rear. You can tell that the wild types look better than the experimentals on the right.
In conclusion, the application of oxidizing heavy metals such as copper sulfate caused the Arabidopsis thaliana to have stunted development, with even more so in the Arabidopsis that had a deactivated AADL gene. It was expected that the mutant Arabidopsis would have stunted development because of our research on the AADL gene. However, it was unexpected that the copper sulfate would result in reproductive failure in the experimental plants. Overall, the previous knowledge on copper sulfate and the AADL gene coincided with the results of our experiment, and our hypothesis was supported by what we found.
On your first graph, what caused the controls to decrease in height? At the very end, on day 6.
Oh,
That's the.
yeah, we believe that's because of the drought that they experienced at the end of our experiment.
On your first slide, when you showed us all those pictures about the copper sulfate, is that like copper sulfate in the river right there where it occurs naturally, or is that just a picture?
No, that is actually runoff from a copper mine. Most of our inspiration for this variable came from the copper mine runoff that was occurring at the time. It was in the news, and we thought it would be a really cool experiment to have our variable be something that was relevant to the time. So yeah, that is copper runoff and other like heavy metals in the river.
How many plants are
After we thinned them out, we had 6 plants in each, but towards the middle and the end, many plants died off. So there probably ended up being about 3 or 4 plants in each experimental planter, and maybe 5 or 6 in controls.
We'd also like to thank Mr. Lally for coming out and all the way to Nelson County to help get input on our experiment, and it definitely added to our presentation. I feel we'd also like to thank the Arabidopsis whole program for allowing us to do this kind
Do the slider on the projector. Do the slider on
Not good.